We knew that it was supposedly a drive-by killing. We knew that she had been shot twice, and that there was a young 19-year-old black boy SNCC worker who was in the car with her. And that the murder was solved overnight, and the Klansmen were arrested, the Klansmen and the FBI informant, but only the Klansmen were being charged. And they were acquitted, and then they were tried by the federal government, and they were given a few years for violating her civil rights. It was when COINTELPRO was exposed in the 70s that we really found out all the details, the real details, and what had happened. There had been pictures of her body, of the crime scene, and autopsy photos that were released to the Klan almost immediately. So those were sent to us. The Klan did a publication, a propaganda publication, and they made sure that we got a copy of it. It was horrifying, but the most horrifying part came with the release of the information about the use of informants and what their actual role was in the civil rights movement.
You are here. We're here in Selma, Alabama, and it's interesting that you mentioned law enforcement, because obviously you're here because we are doing a documentary that surrounds the community and the police. And you are here at a very critical time for our nation. We have just experienced within days the shooting death of Alton Sterling, of Philando Castile, and the Dallas Law Enforcement Massacre within hours of each other. When you look around and when you were viewing that on TV, what were your thoughts?
This is a topic that has so many components, and yet they're not unfamiliar to us. It starts with what was beginning to be a regular event on our news, so that every few days we would see the face of some young black person on TV that had been killed by authorities. I even went through the process of looking up murders by authorities of unarmed people. I limited it to that, and the numbers would astound you. I mean, there's so much more than goes on with that we actually see and it is made really visible. Black Lives Matter is the movement that is carrying a lot of the weight for the things that are going on, and even the statement Black Lives Matter. But white lives have mattered always, and you don't need to say white lives matter. It's black lives that are really what we need to talk about. And it's not to blame anybody, it's not to make anybody angry, it's because we have this horrific problem, I can't even say problem, disaster going on, and we need to look at it fairly. It's in 1965, Jimmy Lee Jackson, an amazing young man from Marion, Alabama, very close here to Selma, was murdered by a state trooper, I believe it was, or a sheriff, for protesting in a very small march. The police came to disperse them. They were abusing his mother and his grandfather, and he stepped in and asked them please not to hurt her, and they shot him in the abdomen. He was he had to come to a hospital in Selma because the hospital closest to him was a white-only hospital, and he died. And 2 weeks later, James Reeb was killed, and the president called James Reeb's family. Then my mother was killed, and the president, after consulting with J. Edgar Hoover and getting permission, called our family. And nobody called Jimmy Lee's family. In fact, I'd be willing to say that very, very few people know Jimmy Lee Jackson's name. I promised myself that I would always mention Jimmy Lee when I mentioned my mother, because I know the pain that we went through. And I can't imagine how much greater it would have been had she not been acknowledged, at least to some extent, that a life had been lost in a cause, trying to do something for what was right. But the thing that we have to realize, I've recently gotten my level 2 certification in Kingian nonviolence, which is basically a study of how Dr. King went about confronting and resolving and healing these major issues. And I think it's important for all of us to realize that we cannot, not to diminish how far we've come because of how far we have to go. But for example, when we talk about mass murders or killings, we rarely include what has happened to the perpetrator as part of that casualty number or that victimization. Their families, them, and of course certainly their victims and their families, and the country and the cultures, the black culture, the white culture, are all affected by these tragedies. So where do we start? I hear a lot of talking. I was on a hotline the other day, and they were talking about forming a coalition, and let's talk to the National Black Caucus, and let's talk to the black leaders of churches and everything. And we have to talk to the police. Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who, as I said, is my mentor in nonviolence, said, when a person does not value their own life, that they cannot go out and take another life with disregard if they really valued their own. And however you look at it, the conversation has to be the community, the police, the victims, the perpetrators. All of us have to be brought together. That's the first step in nonviolence training, is to gather information.